Literary Legends and Luminaries. I'm Julie, and today's episode of Booksmart is a book that makes all those must-read lists. It's The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. Is it the year of magical thinking? I don't know what I expected from the book exactly, but it wasn't what I expected at all. I liked it, and then I didn't. First, let me preface my review that my criticism stems from the way the book is written, not from the events that happened in the book. I think this is important to state. We hesitate to critique a memoir that deals with trauma, loss, death, addiction, and readers that do come out and say they hated it are then criticized because how dare we not gush over the author's trauma. Matthew Perry's memoir is a good example. I'm not criticizing his addiction or the difficulties in beating it, and since he recently died, it's even worse to criticize what he wrote, but that doesn't mean the book was the greatest thing I ever read. We do this often with books, and I hate it. Remember, it's not their experiences we're critiquing, it's how they tell their story. Didion's book deals with the sudden death of her husband. If that wasn't enough to deal with, his heart attack happens when their adult daughter is fighting for her life due to complications from the flu. Didion has to care for her daughter while grieving for her husband, and when her daughter gets worse and not better, well, you can imagine how difficult all of that must be. I loved how she began the book, so I will read you the beginning. It's incredibly relatable. Life changes fast. Life changes in an instant. You sit down to dinner and life as you know it ends. The question of self-pity. Those were the first words I wrote after it happened. The computer dating on the Microsoft Word file, notes on a change, doc, reads May 20th, 2004, 11:11 p.m. But that would have been a case of my opening the file and reflexively pressing save when I closed it. I had made no changes to that file in May. I had made no changes to that file since I wrote the words in January 2004, a day or two or three after the fact. For a long time, I wrote nothing else. Life changes in the instant, the ordinary instant. At some point, in the interest of remembering what seemed most striking about what had happened, I considered adding these words, the ordinary instant. I saw immediately that there would be no need to add the word ordinary because there would be no forgetting it. The word never left my mind. It was in fact the ordinary nature of everything preceding the event that prevented me from truly believing it had happened, absorbing it, incorporating it, getting past it. I recognize now that there was nothing unusual in this. Confronted with sudden disaster, we all focus on how unremarkable the circumstances were in which the unthinkable occurred. And then she goes on to state even more examples of historical events and how it was an ordinary day. We've all been there, at least to some degree. We're just getting along as if it's just another day, and then wham, something dreadful happens. And it's always something dreadful. It's not that we win the lottery or we stumble upon a pile of gold. When this dreadful thing happens, we then blame ourselves in some way, if for no other reason that we were gloriously oblivious to the danger unfolding and we didn't see it coming, although we think we should have seen it coming. It's a powerful way and 100% relatable way to start the book. At first, I couldn't put the book down. I was concerned with her daughter's condition. It was in question. I didn't know if she was going to make it or not. But I immediately disliked two aspects of Didion's memoir. The first one is all the research. I usually love research, especially tidbits that flow with the story, that enhance it or make more sense of it. I didn't feel these segments did much of anything except pull me out of the story. I know Didion is trying to make sense of what has happened, and she's seeking the best known place of information and comfort to her, books. But since this is a published book that is meant for a reading audience of hundreds of thousands of strangers, well, most of those research bits didn't need to be there. She even adds in her daughter's CT report a lengthy paragraph full of medical jargon that only a doctor would understand. I didn't understand its purpose. I think all that research upset the flow of her memoir as it wasn't integrated like a story, but more like a research paper. To give you an example, here is a passage from her memoir, and it's a mouthful. And she's talking about, when people die, what happens and how do we grieve? Certain studies I learned were famous. They were icons of the literature, benchmarks referred to in everything I read. There was, for example, Young, Benjamin, and Wallace, The Lancet, 2-454456, 1963. This study of 4,486 recent widowers in the United Kingdom, followed for 5 years, showed significantly higher death rates for widowers in first 6 months following bereavement than for married. There was Rees and Ludkins, British Medical Journal, 4-13-16, 1967. This study of 903 bereaved relatives versus 878 non-bereaved matched controls, followed for 6 years, showed significantly higher mortality for bereaved spouses in first year. The functional explanation for such raised mortality rates was laid out in the Institute of Medicine's 1984 compilation. Research to date has shown that, like many other stressors, grief frequently leads to changes in the endocrine, immune, autonomic nervous, and cardiovascular systems. All of these are fundamentally influenced by brain functions and neurotransmitters. Yikes. Why is a citation written into the text of the memoir to begin with? That's a research paper no-no. While some of the research material is interesting, there is too much of it and it isn't integrated well. Summarize it, paraphrase it. I don't need all that. The second thing I didn't like about the book, all the name dropping, and not just of people, but places and products and brands. I admit I'm a country bumpkin compared to Joan Didion. I was familiar with her name, but I could not connect her to any particular piece she had written. I even dug through my college anthologies to see if I could find something of hers I had already read, and I couldn't find anything. I then researched her husband. His brother I'm familiar with, Dominique Dunne, who I think is like the print version of Geraldo Rivera. The only piece I know by either Didion or Dunne is the script they wrote for Up Close and Personal, loosely based on the journalist Jessica Savage, starring Michelle Pfeiffer and Robert Redford. So other than knowing that she is an author who has written many books, I did not realize I was dealing with very important people who knew other very important people who lived privileged lives of travel and expensive alcohol and what have you. If I were a very important person, I might have nodded my head in agreement and thought about the time I visited Bogota and ate this at this place, etc. Instead, I felt like I was not in on the story. I was an outsider because I couldn't relate to all those details, which at first just seemed like extraneous information, but as I kept reading, I began to feel as though I understood very little of her details, which is unfortunate, especially when she describes a vortex. Those moments in time when you're standing in one place, but you remember a time in the past when you were also at that place or thinking of the same thing. This is relatable, and I'm not sure any other author has done such a good job at describing these moments we've all experienced. Yet the name-dropping details yanked me out of the story, especially as it continued. I can handle pop culture references that I don't know or can't connect to. I can handle places I've never been or never want to go. But there's something about the very important person detailing their very important lifestyle that is off-putting. I love brand names and pop culture references because those details are incredibly revealing of the writer, even if they're things I can't connect with. But authors who write in that very important prose, I have always struggled to connect with. So maybe that is more on me than the reader, than the writer. I didn't mind Didion's stream of consciousness writing at times. She skips around and repeats herself, and it doesn't always make linear sense, which captures the grieving process well. And some of the stuff she remembers seems sporadic, and maybe it is at times, but she captures these snippets well within her sort of jumbled memoir. Here's an example of a conversation that John had with her daughter years ago. And this was in regards to bad stuff happening. It all evens out in the end, John said, an answer that bewildered me. What did it mean? Couldn't he do better than that? But one that seemed to satisfy her. Several years later, after Susan's mother and father died within a year or two of each other, Susan asked if I remembered John telling Quintana that it all evened out in the end. I said I remembered. He was right, Susan said. It did. I recalled being shocked. It had never occurred to me that John meant that bad news will come to each of us. Either Susan or Quintana had surely misunderstood. I explained to Susan that John had meant something entirely different. He had meant that people who get bad news will eventually get their share of good news. That's not what I meant at all, John said. I knew what he meant, Susan said. Had I understood nothing? Very interesting reflection. What I question the most about the book is its title. The Year of Magical Thinking. At first, I thought I understood why she entitled her memoir as such. In the beginning, after her husband died, she had this notion that he would return. She didn't want to get rid of his shoes, for instance, because he would need them when he came back. But that thought process doesn't hold much weight as the memoir unfolds. Nothing about it was magical thinking. Her title left me confused and a bit irritated. Maybe the title had given me certain expectations of the book I was about to read. The word magical has such a positive connotation, even if it could strike one as delusional. When I finished the book, I just sort of thought, huh? I do like the cover design, though. The John, which you can't see very well on the screen there, they're blue, which spells out John. That was a nice touch. I've essentially concluded this about the Year of Magical Thinking. It was worth the read, yes, but I'm not sure why it made all the must-read books. If someone picks up this book to help them with their own grieving process, I would actually kind of discourage that. I would not recommend this to someone in the midst of grieving. Maybe after time has done its part, then it would be fine. Didion's memoir falls into that same category as last week's Book Smart episode on the Book of Delights. Established authors can do whatever they want in their books, and their loyal followers will buy the book. Editors may not give the book much of their attention, or the established authors have the upper hand anyway. I don't like when I'm reading books that don't include me as a reader. I don't have to understand all the names and know all their fancy restaurants and wine and such, but you do have to remember the reader. And sometimes I think established authors forget about that important element in the reading and writing relationship. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.